The phone buzzed, slicing through the quiet of my kitchen like a small, sharp blade. I saw it instantly, the text, simple and cold. "You're not coming on the cruise." And then, almost before I could lock the screen, another one. "She wants her real dad there." I didn't type. I didn't reply. My fingers hovered over the counter, unmoving. The air seemed thicker than usual, and the morning sunlight felt intrusive. My chest tightened, not from surprise, I'd been here before, but from the weight of being erased in the quietest possible way. Before I tell you what happened next, if this kind of quiet moment hits close to home, you can tap like or drop a comment about where you're listening from. Some stories land differently depending on where you are. Have you ever been erased without anyone raising their voice? My name is Daniel, and I'm in my late 30s. For most of my life, I've learned to stay quiet when I'm being replaced. I set the phone down and let my eyes wander around the kitchen. It was too bright, the sunlight making every surface feel like it was spotlighting my own helplessness. The dishes from last night still sat in the sink, but I didn't think about them. I thought about the message. I reread it in my mind, dissecting the phrasing, the punctuation. Every word was deliberate. No exclamation, no apology, no hesitation. Just fact, just assertion. She had made a choice without asking, without negotiating, without even pausing to consider me. And somehow, I had been conditioned to absorb moments like this with silent endurance. I sat down at the edge of the counter, letting my palms rest on my knees. The room was quiet again, except for the low hum of the refrigerator. It was the kind of quiet that doesn't comfort. It presses in, asking questions you don't want to answer. Questions about why you always stay, why you don't demand your place, why silence feels like the only way to survive. I remembered the small things. A birthday passed without acknowledgement, a suggestion dismissed, the way my presence seemed optional in the home I'd helped build. This wasn't new. It had been coming in subtle increments for years, like water dripping onto stone. The irony struck me. I had spent decades perfecting the skill, quiet endurance, but now the same quiet that protected me from arguments and conflict was the thing that allowed me to be replaced so easily. I thought about what it meant to be a man who stays in the background, who smooths edges, who steps aside. And I realized that every time I had accepted that role, I had been learning how to vanish. I poured a cup of coffee and watched the steam curl upward. It was almost comforting, this mundane ritual, the way the spoon clinked against the mug, the bitter warmth that filled my mouth. I sipped slowly, letting the caffeine ground me. My eyes drifted to the window. Across the street, a moving truck idled. Its engine growled low, impatient, like the world couldn't wait for me to figure out my own place in it. The sight of it made something stir inside me, a dull pulse of anger mixed with recognition. I had built the house, filled it with memories, and yet my value had been measured in moments of convenience. And now, in the span of a single morning, I had been reminded that some choices aren't mine to negotiate. I thought about picking up the phone again, drafting a response, and then deleting it. The words came easy enough, but they would only explain, justify, soften. And what would that accomplish? Her mind was made. There would be no reversal, no acknowledgement of the quiet sacrifices, no recognition of the years spent supporting a life that never quite saw me. I let the phone sit, face down, and took a long, measured breath. In that pause, I felt the first flicker of clarity. Sometimes the most powerful answer is the one you don't give. The morning stretched on, heavy and deliberate. I walked through the rooms of the house, each familiar surface suddenly feeling like a stage set designed for someone else's performance. The living room sofa bore the imprint of late-night conversations I had silently absorbed. The kitchen table carried the echoes of discussions I had facilitated without comment, and the bedrooms held the quiet evidence of nights spent ensuring comfort while my own needs went unnoticed. This house had been a home, yes, but not mine. Not entirely. I was a fixture, a caretaker, a man whose presence had been acknowledged only when convenient. I paused in my daughter's room. The cello she inherited from her grandmother rested in its stand, polished and proud. Memories flared. Her first recital, the way she would beam at me after each small victory, the nights I stayed up helping her practice when no one else was around. And yet, even here, I realized my role was invisible. My dedication was taken for granted, my sacrifices catalogued silently, my value measured only in outcomes that served others. I ran my fingers along the smooth wood, trying to anchor myself to something real. Outside, the moving truck started to pull away. The engine's rumble vibrated through the walls. I could almost feel it in my chest. The world was moving, but my own life felt suspended, a careful balance of restraint and suppressed anger. And yet, I didn't panic. I didn't shout. I didn't storm out into the street. I simply watched, aware that the choice to remain composed was already a statement. In silence, there was power, if I could recognize it. I returned to the kitchen and sat at the counter again, letting my thoughts settle. The messages were still there, quiet but present, a reminder of everything I had endured without complaint. And in that stillness, I realized something crucial. The problem was never the text. It was me, and how I had allowed myself to become invisible in my own life. That recognition carried no bitterness, only a slow, steady pulse of awareness. The kind of awareness that precedes action. By mid-morning, the routine of the house continued as if nothing had shifted. Coffee brewed, dishes waited, the sun angled differently through the blinds. And yet, everything had changed. I felt it in the taut line of my shoulders, in the slow exhale I took as I leaned back. I had always thought patience and quiet were my shields. Now I understood they were also tools, waiting for me to decide what to build, or what to let go. The day stretched ahead, full of small decisions that could be ignored or acted upon. But I didn't feel indecisive. For the first time in years, I felt the subtle stirrings of control returning. Not control over others, not revenge or argument, but over my own place in the world. I wasn't planning a confrontation, I wasn't rehearsing a speech. I was simply acknowledging that my life was mine to steer, however quietly, however deliberately. And yet, even as that realization settled, I knew this was only the first move. There would be moments later, moments of confrontation, of watching faces register what silence had already done. But for now, I simply sat, letting the tension in my chest ebb, the coffee cooling beside me, the house still humming with the echoes of what had been and what could no longer be ignored. The phone remained face down, the messages unread aloud, the weight of them pressing silently, but I was no longer crushed beneath it. I looked toward the window again. Across the street, the moving truck disappeared, leaving only a quiet street and the promise of what comes after recognition. The day was far from over, and every step I took now would be deliberate. The world had assumed I would stay invisible, stay quiet, and I had for decades. But the house, the life, the moments I had silently endured, they were about to meet the man who had finally decided he could speak without saying a word. And somewhere in that quiet, I felt a trace of anticipation, not of drama, not of conflict, but of a long overdue alignment. The first chapter of the day, the first ripple in the water of my life, had begun. The message didn't ask for a response, but I would choose one anyway. Not through words, but through action. And I knew, deep down, that nothing would ever feel quite the same again. The house smelled faintly of brewed coffee and old wood. The kind of smell that feels comforting until it presses against the edges of your patience. I moved through the rooms like a ghost, noting things I'd never really noticed before. A jacket draped across the chair that didn't belong to me, a stack of mail that never carried my name, the quiet hum of a television in the background, reporting stories that seemed distant and unimportant. And yet, every corner of this house bore witness to my life, to my efforts, to my sacrifices. None of it ever demanded acknowledgement. None of it ever earned me presence. I wandered into the kitchen again, letting the knife I picked up tap gently against the cutting board. It wasn't anger I felt, not yet, but a low, simmering awareness. Awareness that the person I had been, the one who stayed useful, who absorbed tension without complaint, who smoothed edges and bridged divides, had been quietly relegated to a role that didn't include choice. My usefulness had always been conditional. My voice had always been optional. And somehow, I had allowed that to become the definition of me. I sipped the now lukewarm coffee and let my thoughts drift back to moments that had seemed inconsequential at the time. My daughter's recital last year, where I stayed behind to fix broken strings while my wife cheered at the side. My sister's wedding, where I adjusted chairs and carried trays while everyone else danced. The small gestures, the endless compromises, none of them had been seen as investments in family, only as expected behavior. And somewhere in the back of my mind, a quiet voice asked, why do I still do this? Why am I always the one who stays behind? I thought about work too. How many times I had stayed late to cover for a colleague, rearranged schedules to meet someone else's convenience, smiled through exhaustion because it kept the gears moving. Recognition rarely followed. Praise was scarce, and gratitude even scarcer. And yet I had carried on. Not because I wanted accolades, but because it was easier than confrontation, easier than drawing attention to myself, easier than insisting that I mattered as much as anyone else. A flicker of anger surfaced, fleeting but sharp. It was the kind of anger that usually came with an apology or explanation, but today it found no outlet. I swallowed it. My muscles relaxed. There was no rush to express the frustration that had quietly accumulated for decades. I had learned early that restraint is its own language, though one that often goes unrecognized. Still, the thought lingered. Every time I stayed quiet, I had given permission for my own invisibility. I wandered into the living room, brushing my hand across the arm of the couch, tracing invisible lines where my presence had been constant but unseen. The pictures on the wall smiled back at me with perfect, staged happiness. My own reflection caught in the glass looked back. A man who had stayed useful, who had endured, who had learned patience at a cost that was only now becoming clear. I wanted to ask, when does it stop? When do I stop being the placeholder, the constant, the invisible? My phone buzzed again, a reminder of messages I had ignored, a signal of connections I had allowed to fade. Not her messages, not yet, other small things, invitations, reminders, notifications of events that didn't include me. And I realized, with a clarity that felt almost dangerous, that every moment I had been useful without demand had been another step in conditioning others to overlook me. I had built a life that functioned beautifully, if you ignored the person sustaining it. I sat back, letting that idea settle. It was uncomfortable, but necessary. The quiet of the house pressed against me again. I walked slowly through the bedrooms, touching the edge of a desk, the back of a chair, the windowsill where the sunlight hit just right in the late morning. Each space reminded me of my silent endurance, the invisible labor I had woven into the very walls. I could feel my pulse quicken, not with panic, but with awareness. Awareness that the life I had accepted as normal had been silently designed to keep me in a corner, always giving, rarely receiving. I paused in front of the mirror in the hallway. My reflection was tired, yes, but there was something else. A subtle line of resolve along my jaw, a weight in my shoulders that had shifted from accommodation to observation. I noticed small details about myself I had long ignored. The slight tremor in my hands when I felt unseen, the way my eyes lingered on opportunities that never materialized for me. I studied my reflection as if preparing to meet someone I hadn't really known. And I realized I had to choose, continue being useful without acknowledgement, or start to measure my value on terms I controlled. The day moved slowly. I avoided my phone, avoided thinking about her message again, and let my mind wander. Memories surfaced without warning. Arguments I had never raised, debates I had let slide, moments where I had swallowed pride for the sake of peace. Each one carried weight. Each one whispered about the cost of my patience. And for the first time, I felt the edges of possibility, that restraint could be a tool, not a trap, if wielded with intention. Lunch came and went. I barely noticed. The sunlight shifted across the kitchen floor, marking time as if indifferent to the storm of thoughts in my head. I moved to the living room, letting the quiet be a canvas. No phone, no interruptions, just the low hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic outside. It was strange, this combination of solitude and awareness. Alone, yes, but not powerless. The clarity came not in words, but in understanding. I had been useful for too long, not by choice, but by default. And the default was about to change. Evening approached, though I hardly acknowledged it. I walked past rooms filled with reminders of obligations fulfilled, love given silently, patience stretched thin. My daughter's cello gleamed in the soft light, untouched yet commanding presence. I remembered her recital again, her eyes shining, the way I had been behind the scenes holding everything together. My lips pressed together. No anger. Just recognition of what had been and the slow, insistent knowledge that my own life could no longer be measured only by what I gave to others. The sun began to tilt lower, casting long shadows across the floor. I stood in the middle of the living room and let my gaze settle on the house, the rooms, the memories etched into the walls. There was sadness here, yes, but also a strange, calm power. The man who had always stayed useful was still here, but for the first time, he was also watching, evaluating, and quietly deciding what mattered to him. The rest could wait. I poured another cup of coffee, letting the steam rise and curl, carrying the faint scent through the room. I sat down, back straight, hands wrapped around the mug. The quiet felt less like confinement now, and more like preparation. A day would come when choices would have to be made. And when that day arrived, I would act from the clarity I had gained, not from impulse, not from anger, but from the simple, unassailable knowledge of my own worth. As night approached, the house seemed to exhale with me. The routine carried on, indifferent, while I felt something subtle but significant shift inside. The acceptance that being useful didn't have to mean being invisible. That staying quiet wasn't weakness, but a choice, and the time for choosing had arrived. And in that quiet, simmering awareness, I understood that this day, ordinary yet quietly seismic, was the beginning of a reckoning that would come not through words, but through action. The man who stayed useful had finally begun to see the rules of his own life, and he would no longer abide by them silently. The afternoon sun slanted through the blinds, drawing stripes across the living room floor that reminded me of a chessboard. Every square, every shadow seemed to map out the moves I had made without consent, the positions I had occupied out of duty rather than desire. I sank into the armchair, letting my hands rest on the worn arms. I thought about my role, the one I had accepted, the one I had been trained to inhabit, the steady, quiet man who fixes things without comment, who mediates tensions without credit, who remains present yet invisible. The role that everyone else depended on, yet never acknowledged. I remembered a meeting at work a few weeks back. I had stayed late, correcting a mistake that wasn't mine, ensuring that a project met deadlines. My colleagues left with smiles and pats on the back for the one who had made a visible contribution, the one who spoke up and took credit. I left unnoticed in a way that felt familiar, safe even. Yet the safety had a cost, the cost of being overlooked, the cost of silence. And I knew, somewhere deep inside, that this pattern mirrored my personal life with devastating accuracy. My mind drifted back to home. How many times had I mediated small conflicts, between my wife and my daughter, between siblings, between friends, always smoothing edges, absorbing tension, ensuring peace? And how many times had I voiced a need or desire only to be ignored or dismissed? The house hummed with normalcy as if oblivious to the emotional labor I carried like a hidden ballast. I thought about the text again. She wants her real dad there. Not a question. Not even an acknowledgement of me. Just a statement that had turned the quiet I relied on into something heavier, something almost intolerable. I rose and wandered through the hallway, fingers grazing the walls like a man feeling for a pulse. Every photograph, every framed memory carried traces of my labor. Moments I had ensured happened, smiles I had helped maintain, but none of it recognized me. I had built structures of convenience for others, and in doing so, I had allowed my own presence to be taken for granted. I felt a flicker of anger, sharp but contained, a reminder that the man who stayed quiet was also a man who had limits. A memory surfaced, sharp and unbidden. A conversation years ago when my daughter had asked me to attend a recital, and I had said yes even though I had an important deadline. The recital went beautifully, my daughter's eyes gleaming with pride, yet my contribution faded into the background. I had thought my presence enough. Now, in retrospect, I realized that my consistent absence from recognition had taught others to assume it would always be so. And with that thought came another. I had been cast in this role willingly, or at least without objection, and now it dictated my life. I sank back into the armchair, running my hand over the armrest. It was familiar, comforting even, but it also felt like a reminder of all the times I had chosen invisibility over acknowledgement. I thought about my wife's message again and the invisible line it drew between us, the invisible hierarchy that placed me consistently lower than the man I had been told I should emulate, the one who could be present and yet remain irrelevant. I let out a slow breath. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was understanding, sharp and unsettling. I had been quiet too long, and my silence had been both shield and shackle. The phone buzzed in my pocket, though I didn't reach for it. I didn't need to. The messages, the missed calls, the invitations I had let go, all of them were part of the same pattern. I had stayed within the parameters assigned to me, and the world had accepted it without question. And now, as I sat there absorbing the implications, I felt the first real pang of frustration, not the quiet simmering that had accompanied me through decades, but something more visceral, more insistent. I had been a fixture, a mediator, a silent worker. And still, somehow, the perception of my presence had never matched my reality. I moved to the window and watched the street below. Children played across the sidewalk, their laughter echoing lightly, indifferent to the patterns of my life. A neighbor waved from across the way. I nodded automatically, yet the motion felt hollow. Everything felt hollow, as if life had been designed for everyone else's satisfaction and my own reflection had been an afterthought. I considered speaking, voicing my irritation, asserting my presence. And then I realized that such actions would be reactive, not deliberate. The man I was becoming would act not out of frustration, but from clarity. The time for reactive behavior had passed. I remembered a small argument from a few months back with my wife, one that had never escalated because I had remained silent. I had been frustrated, hurt even, but I had swallowed the words, smoothed the moment, and let the issue fade without resolution. That night, I had gone to bed feeling hollow, as if my thoughts and my presence didn't matter. And I realized now that this pattern had defined my existence. I had been trained, subtly and persistently, to accept an invisible role. And now, faced with the text, faced with the weight of choice, I understood that the lesson was only just becoming clear. The evening light shifted, casting longer shadows across the room. I traced the lines with my eyes, noting the subtle differences from earlier in the day. The quiet was less oppressive now, tempered by awareness. I thought about all the small, quiet acts of service I had performed over the years and the unacknowledged patience they had required. I thought about the man I had been and the man I could choose to be. And I understood that the transformation would not come from argument, confrontation, or dramatic declaration. It would come from deliberate, measured choices that recognized my value without needing external validation. I walked back into the kitchen, letting my hand brush the counter where I had once sat sipping coffee and absorbing the weight of being invisible. I poured myself another cup, letting the warmth anchor me. I thought about restraint, patience, and the subtle accumulation of power that comes from choosing silence strategically rather than from compulsion. I had always seen my quiet endurance as a weakness, a limitation. But now, for the first time, I recognized it as a potential strength, if wielded consciously. Night began to fall, and the shadows deepened. I sat at the edge of the counter, letting my gaze sweep the familiar spaces of the house. Each room carried echoes of effort unacknowledged, of labor unseen, of patience stretched thin. And I realized that I had spent decades inhabiting a role that was expected of me, a role I had not fully claimed for myself. But that was changing. The recognition that had been denied to me would not be requested or demanded. It would be earned, quietly, deliberately, and without fanfare. My silence, once a shield, was now a tool. My restraint, once a habit, was now strategy. As the last light of day faded, I felt a subtle shift inside. A simmering, controlled awareness that the roles assigned to me could be redefined. The man who had always stayed useful had begun to see the rules, the boundaries, and the expectations. And he understood, finally, that he had the power to decide which ones to honor and which ones to discard. The text, the message, the invisible hierarchy, They had not shattered me. They had clarified me. And that quiet, simmering understanding was the first step toward a day when my choices, at last, would matter. The late afternoon sun cast a warm glow over the living room, but warmth didn't mean comfort. I walked slowly, letting my fingers brush against the edges of furniture, each touch resonating with unspoken memories. This house, these rooms, the walls themselves, they were filled with traces of my labor, my presence, my effort. And yet, every corner carried the subtle reminder that none of it was ever truly mine. It had been a home I had maintained, nurtured, and sometimes defended silently, but never chosen for myself in any meaningful way. I paused by the front door and noticed the family portraits hanging in the hallway. Smiling faces frozen in time, perfectly posed. My own face in some of them, yet somehow distant, muted, an observer in the very moments I had helped orchestrate. My presence had always been expected, like an unspoken rule etched into the fabric of daily life. I would keep things running smoothly, I would absorb frustration and maintain calm, and in return, I would be allowed to exist quietly, unnoticed. It had seemed fair for a long time. Until now. The house felt heavier today, as if it were aware of my awareness. I moved into the kitchen and let my hands rest on the counter, staring out the window at the street beyond. The moving truck from earlier had disappeared, but its presence lingered like a subtle accusation. This home, the life I had built here, had been full of compromises, my compromises, and the realization settled like dust in the sunlight. No one had ever asked if the compromises were worth it. My worth had been measured only in my utility, my patience, my willingness to remain silent. I thought about my daughter's cello, resting proudly in the corner of her room. I remembered her first recital, her excitement, the way she had looked at me with pure, unfiltered joy. And I remembered the nights I had stayed up helping her practice, carrying the emotional weight of her performance without acknowledgement. The house had been witness to my efforts, but it had never celebrated them. And now, faced with the cold clarity of my wife's message, the pattern crystallized. The home had always been my stage, but never my sanctuary. I wandered through the living room again, tracing invisible lines where my hands had adjusted cushions, straightened books, or wiped surfaces. These were small acts of care, yes, but they were also markers of a life spent preserving comfort for others while my own comfort remained peripheral. The irony was not lost on me. A house designed for family and belonging had consistently left me at the edge, relegated to the role of caretaker, invisible presence, silent facilitator. Flicker of something, anger, perhaps, rose within me. It was fleeting, sharp, and immediately suppressed. I had learned long ago that reacting too quickly only reinforced the perception of volatility, and I wanted none of that. I wanted clarity, not chaos. I wanted understanding, not argument. Yet the weight of the years of invisibility pressed down, and I let myself acknowledge it fully for the first time. This was not just a house. It was a repository of my unrecognized effort, a silent testament to patience that had never been returned in kind. I moved toward the hallway, letting my gaze linger on the small imperfections I had tended to over time, a scuffed corner on the wall, a worn patch on the carpet, a window that never quite closed properly until I fixed it. These details, mundane to anyone else, carried the imprint of my constant maintenance, my dedication, my quiet presence. And yet, as I paused to consider them, I realized that my efforts had been invisible by design, expected, absorbed, but never acknowledged. The house had functioned because I had been willing to remain in the background, and that realization now made my quiet fury all the more potent. I walked into the dining room and ran my fingers along the polished surface of the table. How many dinners had I hosted without complaint, smoothing over disagreements, adjusting plans at the last minute, ensuring comfort and cohesion? And yet, not once had anyone considered that these acts had a cost to me. Not once had the house reflected my investment in it. It was full of warmth, of laughter, of life, but none of it had ever felt like it belonged to me. It was a life I had curated for others, a structure I had upheld, a presence I had maintained, and now I understood. That is precisely why the text had struck so deeply. It reminded me of what I had been willing to endure quietly for far too long. The sun dipped lower, casting longer shadows across the floors and walls. I let myself lean against the counter again, tracing the edges of the room with my eyes. I thought about every subtle compromise, every overlooked request, every suppressed desire. Each had been a thread in the tapestry of life I had stitched for others, each a silent contribution that had never been named or noticed. And now, in this late afternoon light, I saw it clearly. The house had been mine only in utility, never in essence. It had been a place to serve, a place to hold, a place to maintain, but not a space for recognition or belonging. I thought of the future in quiet terms, considering the path ahead. My patience, my restraint, my silent endurance, these were not weaknesses. They were tools, if I chose to wield them consciously. I could step forward, finally acting in a manner that reflected my value rather than my compliance. The house, the rooms, the memories, they would remain. But I no longer had to remain trapped within the expectations and roles that had defined me for so long. As evening settled, I walked through the bedrooms one last time. I paused by my daughter's room, noticing the cello again, its polished surface catching the last rays of sunlight. I ran my hand lightly over the instrument, feeling the weight of memory and effort, of care and dedication. And I realized that my role, though once passive, was about to be claimed actively. Not through confrontation, not through declaration, but through deliberate, quiet choice. The house that had never felt fully mine was a witness, and soon it would witness a man who had decided that utility no longer defined him. I returned to the living room, letting my gaze sweep across familiar furniture, framed photographs, and small, unnoticed details. The house was full of life, of evidence of my labor, of traces of endurance. But it was also full of possibility. The possibility of recognition, of change, of asserting presence without drama, without shouting, without anger. I felt the tension in my chest ease, replaced by a slow, steady pulse of awareness. The man who had silently maintained this house was ready to make the first conscious decisions of his life. The day was ending, the shadows deepening, and the quiet settling in. I stood in the middle of the living room and let the weight of the hours press into me. I had acknowledged the house for what it had been, for what it had represented, and for what it had never been. And in that acknowledgement, there was clarity. The house had never been mine in the fullest sense, but that would not determine what I chose next. The next moves, the next choices, would belong to me entirely, and that quiet realization carried a power that was almost palpable. The house stood as it always had, but I had shifted within it, and that was enough. The role I had played silently for years was ending, and I was finally ready to consider the life I wanted to inhabit on my own terms. The evening settled in quietly, a thin wash of orange and gray light spilling across the kitchen floor. The house felt different now, as if the walls had absorbed my understanding from earlier, holding it gently but firmly, like a patient observer. I sat at the edge of the counter, coffee long cold, and stared at the phone lying face down beside me. I knew the buzzes it had delivered earlier had been ignored, and yet the weight of possibility lingered. There were messages I could send, calls I could make, words I could speak, but each option carried a cost I wasn't yet ready to pay. I thought about picking up the phone, drafting a response, and deleting it over and over, like rehearsing a conversation in my mind that would never take place. Each word I imagined seemed hollow, either an apology I didn't owe or an explanation I didn't need. I realized that any attempt to speak would be reactive, a knee-jerk response to a situation that had already defined me in silence. And the man who had learned to endure quietly had reached a crucial point. He could choose not to speak, and in that choice, he could regain control. I let my thoughts drift back to past occasions when I had stayed silent. Arguments dissolved because I refused to engage. Opportunities passed because I refrained from claiming them. Moments of recognition slipped away because I measured my worth through patience rather than assertion. And for decades it had worked, except that it hadn't. I had survived, yes, but in surviving, I had allowed others to define my place, my importance, and my voice. And now, confronted with the text, with the quiet erasure of my presence, I recognized that survival alone was no longer sufficient. I ran my fingers along the counter, tracing the worn edges with deliberate slowness. I thought about what I could say, what I should say, and what I wouldn't say. The truth was quiet but potent. Explanation was optional, justification unnecessary, and silence could be more powerful than any words I might force. My restraint, cultivated over decades, was no longer a habit. It was a strategy. The phone didn't need to be picked up. The messages didn't need to be answered. The power lay in choosing when and how to act, not in responding immediately. I thought about my daughter, practicing her cello in the other room. Her dedication mirrored my own in a quiet, almost imperceptible way. I had always stayed behind the scenes, guiding, supporting, correcting without expectation. Her music filled the house now, a gentle reminder that persistence and patience carried weight even when unacknowledged. And for the first time, I considered what it meant to wield that weight for myself. To act deliberately rather than reacting out of habit. The phone buzzed again, a soft vibration that echoed like a heartbeat through the quiet. I resisted the urge to reach for it, letting it rest where it lay. I imagined my response, my voice, my explanations, and I realized that none of them would change the facts. I had been overlooked. I had been silent. I had been relegated to a role I hadn't fully claimed. And yet there was no need to argue. No need to apologize. No need to justify. The power was in my restraint, in my deliberate patience, in the calm that comes from understanding one's own worth without external acknowledgement. I leaned back against the counter, closing my eyes for a moment, letting the tension in my shoulders ease. The house hummed around me, quiet but alive, filled with evidence of labor and care, of patience and endurance. And within that quiet, I felt a subtle shift, a sense that I was no longer merely reacting to the world, but observing it, measuring it, and preparing to act with intention. The text, the message, the erasure, it had not forced me into a corner. It had illuminated the rules I had unconsciously followed and allowed me to consider which of them I would continue to honor and which I would discard. I thought about my wife, her expectations, her assumptions, and the invisible boundaries she had drawn around me. I imagined the words I could speak and the responses I could anticipate. And then I realized that none of it mattered. Not yet. The choice before me was not to explain, to justify, or to argue. It was simply to act from clarity rather than impulse. To let silence carry weight. To let restraint be a vehicle for deliberate transformation. The house had always been a reflection of my service, my presence, my patience. Now it became a canvas for my decisions, a backdrop against which I could assert my presence without uttering a single word. I walked through the living room slowly, letting my fingers graze the edges of furniture, the frames on the wall, the subtle imperfections that spoke of my labor and attention. Each touch was a reminder of my role, yes, but also of the power I now held in choosing when and how to step beyond it. I paused by the front window, watching the last remnants of daylight slip away, the street empty and quiet. The city outside moved at its usual pace, unaware of the quiet reckoning unfolding in this small, familiar space. And in that quiet, I felt a rare sense of anticipation, not for confrontation, not for recognition, not for drama, but for deliberate action. The power of silence, of patience, of restrained observation had finally become clear. I could act not because I was angry, not because I had been wronged, but because I had chosen to reclaim my own agency. I returned to the counter, setting my hands firmly on its surface. I felt grounded in a way I hadn't before, the accumulation of decades of quiet endurance coalescing into a slow, steady awareness. The day had been ordinary in many ways, yet seismic in its implications. The choice to remain silent, to resist reactive communication, to let clarity guide my next move, that was the first step toward reclaiming the power that had always existed quietly within me. As night deepened, I allowed myself a rare moment of reflection. The phone remained face down, the messages unread aloud, and I felt no urgency, no panic. Instead, I recognized the potency of my restraint, the quiet strength of deliberate choice. The call I didn't make, the words I didn't speak, the explanations I withheld, all of them were acts of power, subtle but undeniable. And in that understanding, I felt a shift, The man who had spent decades accommodating, serving, and remaining quiet was now preparing to act from clarity rather than compulsion. The house exhaled with me in its stillness. I could feel the culmination of my patience, the quiet accumulation of decisions deferred but not forgotten. The night outside was calm, indifferent, and the lights within the house glimmered softly, reflecting the subtle power of my awareness. I had not yet acted, but I had observed, calculated, and recognized my own value. And in that recognition, I knew the next step would be deliberate, intentional, and wholly mine. The call I didn't make was not a sign of weakness. It was a preparation, a gathering of clarity before the action that would finally assert my presence and my worth. The night was quiet, the house settling into its usual rhythm as I sat in the living room, the cello's faint echo from my daughter's practice room still lingering in the air. For hours, I had resisted the urge to respond, the phone lying silently beside me, buzzing occasionally but ignored. Each vibration had been a temptation, a chance to justify, explain, or plead my presence. But I had stayed silent, observing, listening, and letting the weight of years of invisibility settle into something sharper, clarity. I took a deep breath, feeling the tension in my shoulders slowly release, and let my gaze wander over the familiar furniture, the photographs, the subtle imperfections I had maintained for decades. Every object carried evidence of my effort, patience, and endurance. And tonight, that evidence no longer felt like a reminder of sacrifice alone. It was proof of the patience that could now guide deliberate action, of restraint that could be wielded with intention rather than necessity. For a long moment, I considered picking up the phone, imagining the words I could type, the explanations I might offer. But I realized that no words could capture the quiet power of presence, the calm control I had cultivated. The text, the message, the erasure, it had not diminished me. It had clarified the choices I had been avoiding for decades. And now, at last, I understood that action without impulsive emotion would be more potent than any argument, any apology, or any confrontation. I walked through the rooms, my fingers brushing the edges of walls, furniture, and photographs, tracing the invisible lines I had maintained for others. The house, once a symbol of my utility, had transformed in my mind into a stage for deliberate choices. I understood that the silence I had upheld, the patience I had cultivated, and the restraint I had practiced were no longer defensive tools. They were instruments of control, of clarity, of personal agency. And it was time to use them. I sat again at the counter, letting my hands rest on its smooth surface, and considered the future with a new lens. The first realization was simple yet profound. I did not need to explain myself to anyone. The second, I did not need to justify my decisions. And the third, I could act decisively without needing acknowledgement, without needing validation, without needing anyone else to recognize my worth. The power had been mine all along. It had simply waited for me to claim it consciously. I thought about my daughter and the silent lessons she had been absorbing from me for years. Dedication without expectation, presence without reward, effort without recognition. It occurred to me that my choice now would carry weight beyond myself, teaching her, in quiet but unmistakable ways, that dignity and agency are earned through deliberate action, not through the approval of others. And I felt a subtle surge of resolve, a recognition that this was the moment to act from clarity, not from impulse or emotion. The clock ticked on, each second reinforcing the stillness and the gravity of the decision. I felt the tension building not as panic, but as focus. This was the precipice I had been approaching for years, the point where accumulated patience, observation, and silent endurance converged into a moment demanding deliberate choice. And I realized that my previous restraint had not been in vain. It had prepared me for this moment, this act of quiet assertion that would define not only how I was perceived, but how I perceived myself. I rose from the counter and walked to the window, looking out at the street below, the evening shadows stretching long and calm. I let my gaze settle, observing without judgment, understanding without explanation. The decision crystallized. I would act, but not through confrontation. I would reclaim my agency, my presence, and my authority, not with anger, but with the quiet confidence of a man who has understood the value of patience. This was the power of restraint transformed into deliberate choice. My mind circled back to the phone, the messages, the erasure, the patterns of invisibility that had been reinforced for decades. And I knew that any response would be measured, intentional, devoid of the habitual apologies or explanations that had defined my past interactions. The clarity was simple. I would not be reactive. I would not be desperate for acknowledgement. I would assert my presence through deliberate, unassailable action, letting the quiet weight of my choices speak louder than any words ever could. I moved to the living room once more, letting the familiar furniture and photographs anchor me in the present. I traced the outline of the armchair with my hand, letting the texture remind me of decades of patience, decades of silent endurance, decades of preparation. And then, with a slow, deliberate breath, I understood that the moment had arrived. The moment I would stop being invisible, the moment I would act from clarity, the moment I would reclaim my own authority without needing to explain or justify. I sat down in the armchair, hands folded calmly, feeling the accumulated weight of all previous silence settle into a steady, deliberate strength. I knew that the actions I would take in the coming hours would not be dramatic, not theatrical, but they would be consequential. The clarity I had earned through decades of observation and restraint would guide me, ensuring that my decisions reflected my own value rather than the expectations of others. And in that understanding, there was a quiet triumph, a recognition that true power lies not in confrontation, but in measured, deliberate action. The house itself seemed to exhale alongside me, holding the silence as witness, echoing the quiet but profound realization that this was my moment. I had learned patience, endurance, and restraint. I had absorbed the erasure of my presence for years. And now, finally, I was choosing. Choosing not through words, not through explanation, but through intentional action. The man who had remained silent for decades was ready to step forward, not with noise, not with anger, not with pleading, but with deliberate, unshakable clarity. And in that quiet room, surrounded by the evidence of a life meticulously maintained for others, I felt the subtle thrill of control return, steady and unyielding. The moment had come. The decision had been made. The man who had waited in silence, the man who had been invisible for too long, had finally chosen. And from that choice, the rest of the world would have to reckon with him, not through words, but through the undeniable presence of a life claimed deliberately, consciously, and without apology. Morning light spilled through the blinds, sharp and deliberate, cutting across the floor in long, defined lines. I woke with a calm I hadn't felt in years, not the restless, rehearsed calm of endurance, but the measured, deliberate calm of clarity. The house hummed quietly around me, a witness to the hours I had spent in thought, the patience I had cultivated, and the silent decisions I had made. Today would be different. Today, restraint would become action, and observation would become assertion. I walked through the living room slowly, letting the texture of the furniture, the photographs on the walls, and the familiar imperfections anchor me in the present. Each object reflected a life I had maintained for others, a testament to decades of silent service. But now, the perception of utility had shifted in my mind. It no longer defined me. My patience, my restraint, and my deliberate observation had prepared me for this day. I understood that power did not always arrive with loud proclamations. Sometimes it arrived quietly, measured, and unassailable. I glanced at the phone, still lying face down on the counter. Messages from her, from friends, from obligations I had ignored, all buzzed quietly, calling for attention. But I remained still. I didn't pick it up. Not yet. Each vibration was a test, and I allowed the calm I had nurtured to guide me. I had learned that reaction without deliberation was predictable and fleeting. Today, clarity would govern my choices. Every step, every word, every action would carry the weight of intention rather than impulse. The daughter's cello echoed softly from her room, a subtle soundtrack to the rising tension within me. I had been invisible for decades, and yet, here in this house, surrounded by evidence of my labor, I recognized a quiet potency. Every act of care, every gesture of patience, every unacknowledged effort, it all culminated now in deliberate, unspoken authority. The power was not in confrontation, but in the measured decisions I would enact. I dressed deliberately, each movement slow and purposeful. No rush, no panic. I was aware of the world outside, of expectations, assumptions, and judgments. But I had reclaimed my internal perimeter, the quiet space from which I could operate without compromise. I considered the text that had started this chain of reflection. She wants her real dad there. I had felt erasure, rejection, and dismissal. But now, in the clarity of restraint, I saw opportunity, not for revenge, not for argument, but for assertion. To act on my terms, with precision, not noise. The house felt different today, as if attuned to my internal shift. I walked through rooms, touching the edges of furniture, pausing at photographs, noticing every subtle imperfection I had maintained. These traces of labor, once evidence of sacrifice alone, had become markers of preparation, a roadmap of patience waiting to be converted into action. The familiar walls no longer constrained me, they framed me, providing context for deliberate, intentional steps. I moved to the window and looked out at the street below. People passed by, unaware of the quiet reckoning unfolding within these walls. The calm outside contrasted sharply with the potential energy inside me. I felt a steady pulse of anticipation, an awareness that the culmination of years of endurance, observation, and restraint was about to translate into action. And yet, the key remained control. There would be no shouting, no argument, no emotional pleading. There would be only the quiet assertion of presence, built on decades of patient preparation. By mid-morning, I had prepared myself mentally for the encounters to come. Each interaction would carry weight, not because of volume or drama, but because it would be deliberate, intentional, and unassailable. I knew that the subtle accumulation of patience, of quiet endurance, had created a foundation strong enough to support this pivotal day. And I felt a rare exhilaration, not loud or frantic, but deep, measured, and powerful. I walked into the kitchen, where the sunlight now lit the room fully, illuminating every detail. Each surface, each object, each imperfection was a silent witness to the years of preparation, the patient observation, and the deliberate restraint that had defined my past. And now, the future would be defined by action. Not impulsive, not reactive, not desperate, but intentional. Every step forward would reflect the quiet authority I had cultivated, and each decision would reaffirm my presence and worth. By noon, the first interactions began. I chose my words carefully, each phrase measured, each gesture deliberate. No anger, no pleading, no explanations. The people around me reacted, not with immediate comprehension, but with subtle shifts, small recognitions, and the gradual understanding that I had changed. The man who had been silent, the one who had absorbed tension, who had mediated without acknowledgement, who had stayed invisible, was now present in a way that could not be ignored. And the power of that presence, the quiet authority it carried, was palpable. Afternoon faded into evening, and the cumulative effect of my deliberate actions became apparent. The invisible boundaries that had defined my life for decades began to shift. People adjusted unconsciously to the new rhythm, the new expectation that my presence, my choices, and my voice carried weight without demand, without argument. I had not raised my voice, I had not created drama, but the equilibrium had changed. Recognition, respect, and authority were emerging from clarity and restraint, not from noise or confrontation. As night fell, I sat in the living room, the soft glow of lamps illuminating the familiar furniture and photographs. The house seemed to exhale with me, bearing witness to the day that had begun with clarity and concluded with subtle yet undeniable transformation. I felt a quiet satisfaction, a deep understanding that true power had arrived not in shouting or demand, but in measured action rooted in patience, observation, and deliberate choice. The day was over, yet its significance would ripple forward. The man who had been invisible, patient, and silent had emerged, not dramatically, not theatrically, but with deliberate authority. The house, once a symbol of unseen labor, had become a stage for the assertion of presence. And as I sat there in the stillness, I knew that the foundation for the future had been laid, built on restraint, deliberate choice, and the quiet, unassailable power of clarity. The day everything changed had arrived, and with it, a new equilibrium, earned, measured, and wholly mine. Night had fully settled over the house, a calm that felt earned rather than given. I sat in the living room, the soft lamplight casting long, familiar shadows across the floor, and let myself breathe. The day had been unlike any in years, deliberate, measured, and quietly transformative. I could feel the residual energy of every calculated choice, every restrained word, every silent observation now converging into a steady, confident awareness. This was the culmination of decades of patient endurance, and the clarity I had earned settled into my bones. I walked slowly through the rooms, taking note of the traces of my labor and patience, the slight imperfection of a corner I had fixed, the polished surfaces of the tables I had maintained, the faint hum of the cello my daughter had left in her room. Each detail was a testament not to sacrifice, but to the quiet accumulation of deliberate, intentional effort. I had always believed my silence to be a burden, my restraint a limitation. Now I understood that both were tools, powerful instruments of influence when wielded with clarity. Sitting at the edge of the counter, I reflected on the months, the years, the decades that had led to this point. The text from my wife had been the spark that illuminated what I had long known. My presence had often been invisible, my value unacknowledged, my role taken for granted. But in that quiet reckoning, I discovered that acknowledgement was not the point. The point was agency. The ability to decide when and how I would act, and what consequences I would allow to affect me. Silence was no longer a passive shield, it had become an active form of power. I thought of my daughter, asleep now in her room, and the subtle lessons she had been absorbing for years. Dedication without expectation. Effort without applause. Patience without acknowledgement. I realized that through my own deliberate choices, I was modeling strength for her in the most fundamental way, by showing that control, clarity, and self-respect are earned quietly, from within, not demanded from the world. My silence, once misunderstood, had become a guidepost for integrity and deliberate agency. The phone remained on the counter, face down, its buzzes quiet in the night. I had no need to check it, no need to respond. My presence, my choices, and my decisions had weight without explanation. Every message ignored was not weakness, but intention. Every word unsaid was not concession, but strategy. The power of restraint had revealed itself fully, and I felt no tension, no anxiety, only the calm that comes from acting with full awareness and deliberate purpose. I wandered back into the living room and settled into the armchair, letting the familiar contours embrace me. The house, once a canvas of my labor for others, now reflected my own clarity and control. I had claimed agency not through confrontation or drama, but through the quiet assertion of deliberate choice. The patterns that had defined my life, silence, patience, and understated effort, had been transformed from tools of invisibility into instruments of power. And in this realization, I felt a profound sense of accomplishment, earned through self-restraint rather than external validation. I reflected on the past weeks, the tension, the text messages, the sense of being overlooked. Every moment of discomfort, every subtle erasure, had been a lesson in endurance, observation, and strategic patience. Each day, each interaction, each decision had laid the groundwork for the clarity I now possessed. And in this clarity, I recognized a new equilibrium, one where my presence mattered not because it was demanded or requested, but because it was consciously asserted, deliberate, and unassailable. The house was quiet, a mirror of my inner state. I let the stillness settle around me, absorbing the satisfaction of deliberate action. The world outside would continue at its usual pace, unaware of the subtle transformation that had taken place within these walls. But the man I had been, the one who absorbed tension, remained invisible, and endured silently, was now replaced by someone who acted with clarity, agency, and quiet authority. The shift was internal, profound, and irreversible. I had discovered that power does not always roar. Sometimes it rests, deliberate and unshaken, in the quiet choices we make. I closed my eyes and let the day's events and my reflections wash over me. The silent assertion of my presence, the deliberate withholding of reaction, the measured choices, all coalesced into a singular understanding. My life could now be directed consciously, not dictated by the expectations of others. The subtle, patient accumulation of restraint had finally manifested in agency. And with agency came freedom, respect, and the profound clarity of knowing that my decisions, my voice, and my presence were mine to wield. Finally, I stood and moved to the window, looking out at the street below, empty and calm under the night sky. The shadows of the house stretched long and familiar, yet within them I sensed a new alignment, a home no longer merely a stage for others' expectations, but a space where deliberate action, silent power, and clarity could coexist. I felt the weight of decades lift slightly, replaced by a steady, assured energy that came from understanding my own value and claiming it consciously. I returned to the armchair, allowing the calm to settle fully, the warmth of self-respect radiating quietly through me. The house, the rooms, the photographs, the traces of labor, they were witnesses, not masters. I had learned that silence, when chosen deliberately, is more powerful than words. Patience, when cultivated intentionally, is more influential than argument. And restraint, when exercised consciously, can reshape not only perception, but reality itself. As the night deepened, I finally allowed myself to relax completely. The man who had been silent, overlooked, and underestimated had emerged not through confrontation, drama, or emotional display, but through deliberate, unyielding clarity. The home that had never truly felt like mine now reflected the quiet power I had cultivated. And in that reflection, I understood the truth I had long sensed but never fully realized. True strength is earned in silence, and true authority is claimed through deliberate, measured action. The journey had been long, the lessons hard, but the result was undeniable: a life reclaimed, a presence asserted, and a future defined by choice.